Hi everyone, my name is Iqbal Chaudhary. I'm a PhD student in Hopkins and I organize this event called Fireside Management Chat every other Friday. So this chat is all about having people from industry and academia to answer some of the burning questions that we have related to management consulting. One such important question is about what to do when we want to go into life science consulting, and we have a fantastic guest with us today. His name is Aniruddha Kaushik. He's he's a Hopkins alumnus and he's a friend. So Anu is a senior consultant in life sciences at Guidehouse, which was formerly Navigant. So prior to joining Guidehouse, Anu interned at MedTech Ventures, where he served as an expert analyst for venture capital investment and merger and acquisition advisory engagements. So including performing market analysis and landscape assessment for small cap medical device companies as well. So he has experience doing all that. Anyway, so Anu will talk about life science consulting today, and things related to the interview process, and some information about the company that he works with right now. And we'll have an interactive case study at the end. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Anu. Thanks, Anu, for spending your time with us.
Yeah, thanks,
And
Iqbal.
yeah,
Thanks,
and
Iqbal,
some
for the great intro. Go ahead. I'll let you
Sure.
finish
No,
it.
yeah, just quick housekeeping rules. You can ask a question. You can type your questions in the chat box. Let's make it interactive. So you can type all your questions in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and ask a question as well. And as you probably have already noticed, that this video is getting recorded. This session is getting recorded because we want the content to be available for our future members. So if you have issues with recording, you can also stop sharing your video. All right, I would not take more time, and please go ahead and good luck.
Great. Thanks, Iqbal. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. I have some slides prepared. Let's see. All right. Hopefully you guys are able to see my screen. So my name is Anu. Iqbal gave a great introduction, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the stuff he mentioned about my background. But really, I think I want to make this as fluid of a conversation as possible. So if you guys can put stuff in the chat, feel free. But I think based on what I'm looking at, it would be nice if you guys just unmute yourself and straight up interrupt me. I'm totally cool with that. That might be a little better because I don't have to kind of read through the question and then waste more time, because we only have like a little more than an hour. Just a quick background of what I want to cover today. I'll talk a little bit about myself, and we'll kind of go into like a high level discussion on what is consulting, why is it for you. I am assuming that a lot of you are sort of still early stage, thinking about, is consulting the right career opportunity for me, and why I should consider it. And so we'll sort of hopefully answer some of your questions regarding the field as a career path. Talk a little bit about life science consulting in particular, and about some of my experience into breaking into consulting from academia and PhD. So I know a lot of you might be master's students, and do keep in mind that a lot of my experience is sort of going from PhD into consulting. And so a lot of the stuff I'll talk about references like workflows and processes that are in place for getting PhDs into the consulting world. But I think there's a lot of overlap with masters as well. And so take what you can out of my talk. And if you have more questions, you can obviously reach out to me later on, and I can put you in touch with people that might be better able to speak to your specific pathway. Then at the end, let's see how much time we have. We'll go through a case example, and we'll kind of have different levels of interactivity depending on how much time's remaining. So let's jump right into it. So this is me. You guys can see me. I don't know why I put a picture, but this was like a stock slide I had. I am a senior consultant at Guidehouse. So when I applied to Guidehouse, it was called Navigant. It was a different company. Navigant got acquired by Guidehouse when I had my first interview, actually. So and at this point, Guidehouse is pretty much sort of taken in Navigant, and I'll talk a little bit later on about how Navigant fits into the entire Guidehouse framework. But my specific area is in life sciences, fits in with my background, which was in mechanical engineering, developing diagnostic devices. So I worked at the Biomems and Single Molecule Dynamics lab. Some of you might know Professor Jeff Wong. He has a pretty large lab that spans BME, MECI. And during my time in the lab, I did some part-time work at a VC firm just to understand the VC space a little better. And this was around the same time I was applying for consulting jobs, just to kind of see if VC is the right place for me. And if you guys have questions about that later on, we can try to answer some of your questions about VC, but I think I'll keep this talk mostly focused on consulting. Come from Ohio State before that. So my home office for Guidehouse is New York City. I was supposed to move into New York City, but as you all know, COVID hit, and I am right now working from home, back at my home in Ohio. So I'm right now in Cincinnati, Ohio. And most of my work that I do is all remote right now because of COVID. And I started, as you can see, in August of this year. And so it's been like a little more than 4 months. So also keep that in mind, because a lot of what I'll be talking about is kind of moving into the consulting world. And within those 4 months, I've done some 3 going into 4, like 3.5 or so projects. And so I've gotten good amount of experience, but I think that as you have different speakers in this fireside chat series, you'll get more perspective of people that have been in consulting for a little longer as well. So just keep that in the back of your mind as I talk to some of my experience. Okay, so at a very high level, why should you consider consulting? So a lot of you might be PhDs. For me, this was especially true. Came in, I was excited, wanted to become professor, wanted to do something cool in my field. And the more you stay in your PhD career, the more you realize how difficult that process is, and more demoralizing things get as experiments don't work out. But somewhere around like halfway through your PhD, for most people, for me at least, I started to think about what are other exit strategies, what are other options that are out there, industry, government, VC, consulting. And all of these are good options, and all of these leverage a lot of the knowledge and sort of logical reasoning that you develop as during your PhD. But for me, consulting seemed really attractive because it offers a degree of career flexibility. So people can get into consulting and then kind of get back out into any of those other fields, VC, government, industry. In very rare cases, I've heard of people going into consulting and then going back into academia. But the reason most people will get out of academia is to get out of academia, not to get back in. So yeah, I think career flexibility was like one of the major reasons why I chose to pursue consulting. And really, I think there's a lot of consulting firms that recruit heavily at Hopkins, and you're probably aware of that. And these consulting firms are essentially what you do as a management consultant is you give expert advice, right? And where your background as a PhD or advanced degree candidate comes in is you have had the opportunity to apply and develop some of that analytical rigor and hypothesis-based thought process that goes into a lot of these projects that we do as consultants. And you probably, if you've done a PhD level project or even master level projects, have had opportunities to come up with some kind of creative solutions. And a lot of consulting is sort of following this rigorous analytical process, gathering data, making sense out of the data, and providing creative implications based on the data. As a consultant, you get to work on some really interesting problems. So as I said, I've done 3 going on 4 projects. Some have been super fast. The first one that I got put into was like a 3-week engagement where we had to basically advise the company on whether or not they should acquire another company, M&A basically. So that was super fast. So when I talk about living at 2x speed, it was just we'd have like these multiple weekly touch points with the client, and then between those touch points is basically gather as much data as you can for the project, kind of leverage all that data to come up with some kind of useful implications and advice for our client. Through the consulting process or jobs, you also get to work with pretty bright people. At my company, and we'll talk about this a little later when I show more Guidehouse specific slides, we have people with PhD backgrounds, MD backgrounds, all kinds of different backgrounds. I work with a lot of MBAs, obviously, because this is the business world. And you get to really learn a lot from all of these people, as well as on the client side, you get to meet some pretty ambitious executives, uh, people that are high up, people that think about where a company should go in terms of strategy. And um, it's really good to kind of have that sort of rounded experience of getting all these perspectives in your mind. And finally, as I said, career flexibility. Some cool examples are with management consultants moving into other interesting fields, we know that our next department or Secretary of Transportation, Mayor Pete, was an ex-McKinsey consultant. You'll see a lot of consultants in a lot of different fields, but there's also like a big chunk of consultants that end up going into sort of VC specific jobs, because there's a lot of transferable skill sets, but you also see a lot of consultants going into industry, into sort of strategy level, management level, often executive level jobs as well. Okay, so what is life science consulting, and where does it sort of fit in? So as you know, there are a lot of different consulting firms out there, a lot of sort of broad firms that cover uh, a wide scope. And a lot of these broad firms also have sort of life science wings that cover life science companies as well. But in general, life science consulting is basically consulting for pharmaceutical, biotech, medtech type of companies, and often also like regulatory agencies and even government if they're involved in any sort of like life science type projects. This is distinct from healthcare consulting. Healthcare consulting is more about sort of payer provider working with hospitals type consulting. I know that there's a large pipeline of people from Hopkins that go into healthcare specific consulting. Um, I unfortunately don't have that much experience in healthcare consulting, but I know people that are in it. So if you have questions specific to healthcare consulting, again, reach out to me and I can put you in touch with relevant individuals. And in terms of engagements, from my experience, like a lot of life science healthcare life science consulting are around sort of developing strategy. So the strategy could be around, as I spoke about before, M&A, around product development, around competitive landscape assessments or wargaming. You're with the client wants to know what its competitors are going to do, and you basically try to set up some scenarios where the client can sort of counteract anything that a competitor does. Part of it could also be operational in terms of optimizing their profit and loss. Also, there's quite a bit of people in my firm that do project management specific consulting. So if a particular product is being launched by a company, you help them sort of manage the launch process and serve as essentially the project managers for that launch process. That's just an example. Other areas could be like regulatory, market access, financial optimization. In a couple of slides, I'll get into more specific details on what areas of this Guidehouse covers, but this is just a very kind of high level picture of life science consulting. And how do you get into these firms? So this is the typical routes for PhDs, and there are three different areas here, I would say. One is a lot of you might be aware of the summer workshops. So I can think of at least 4 or 5 firms that do pretty solid summer workshops. And these used to be sort of in-person workshops. And I remember doing a couple of them where you basically go in, you meet a lot of different people that are being recruited as well, that are sort of still early stage trying to think about whether consulting is the right fit for them, but are taking the step to kind of move closer to kind of interviewing towards consulting. And you get a lot of different sort of team exercises and case exercises, and a lot of these workshops are centered around you solving a case with a team, and at the end presenting it to a client, and then the client basically asking you questions based on your presentations. And these are great. These are great to get to know what consulting is all about, get to meet people, get to network with people. And in terms of, I guess, because these happen sort of very, very early in terms of the recruitment cycle, they often oftentimes people come into there with very little experience of consulting itself and solving cases. And these often lead to first round interviews with particular firms. And because this is such an accelerated process, oftentimes people are just don't have as much time in preparing for these interviews. But these are great to get sort of a first impression and leave a first impression and gain your network. And so that's one sort of bucket. Not everybody goes through this summer workshop process. There's also sort of more traditional and something that's absolutely necessary for getting into consulting, which is networking. With JHECC, who I was involved with during my days at Hopkins, there's a lot of different touch points with actual consultants to build your network and um, start figuring out how they got into consulting and kind of help use some of that information to kind of chart your path as well. Networking helps with referrals, and it's absolutely important in the consulting world. In all of these different sort of buckets, you have to be able to connect with people to build your network, and only if you are sort of remembered can you sort of move on through the breaking into process for consulting. So yeah, as I said, leverage JGCC, get some experience at consulting itself. I think the pro bono opportunities are great for that. And even the case competitions, just to kind of bolster your understanding of what consulting entails. And I think in the vast majority of people that do end up going into consulting go with the traditional application process. And this is like, it used to be at least these career fairs at Hopkins where you go and you meet with the representatives and then you interview through handshake. I'm not sure how it's done nowadays because of COVID, everything is sort of flipped on its head. But I think the general process still stands. So you apply either through handshake or online, you speak to people that are in the firm. And there's typically 2 rounds of interviews. First round can be on campus or on site. And then there's a second round that is typically on site. And now I'm assuming everything is probably just virtual. And typically with these interviews, they happen fast. So you'll do your first round interview. Within a week, you'll know about if you're into the second round. And after the second round, within a week, you'll know if you got an offer or not. So in that sense, I think breaking into consulting is great because you get your answer like right away once you're in the interview process. But sort of getting to that point requires a good amount of case practice networking, just kind of understanding the field better. Okay, just want to take a quick detour, and I think I'll come back to what the interviews are like and what you should expect with the interviews and how you should prepare for the interviews. But before that, I just want to take a quick detour, talk a little bit about Guidehouse. I spoke to our recruitment team, and they were like, they basically they gave me some slides to sort of pitch, and I was happy to do so. So Guidehouse, as I mentioned, is a company that acquired Navigant, which is the company that I had entered into. Guidehouse is a large firm. It was a spin out of PwC, and it was specifically their public sector consulting firm. So Guidehouse, like legacy Guidehouse, not including Navigant, has a lot of projects with government entities, with the regulatory entities, not only in the US, but across the world. And Navigant jumping into Guidehouse also extends that relationships with commercial entities, so like life science companies, med tech companies, and so on, as well as hospitals, which is the healthcare consulting wing. Yeah, so it's a pretty large consulting firm, a lot of different areas that it stretches out into, great community of people, a lot of diverse backgrounds. And so far, I think everybody I've met has been like super awesome and nice and very helpful. To kind of jump in a little deeper, with Guidehouse, as I mentioned, there's a lot of different sort of areas that stretch out into. Where I sit is in commercial health, which is where Navigant was placed. And more specifically within commercial health, I sit somewhere around the life sciences area. So within commercial health, as I mentioned, we have our payer provider consulting. There is consulting with public health agencies that life science is getting more and more involved with now. So regulatory agencies like FDA and so on. Where I sit is in life sciences, and we work primarily with pharmaceutical biotech type companies. Let's see. Yep. So our life science area in specific is probably has, I think, 200, 300 people. We have a large amount of people with advanced degrees, so MD, PhD, PharmD, and so on, as well as a good amount of people with MBAs and other degrees as well. We have a long standing experience and long-standing relationships with a lot of pharmaceutical and medtech companies. A lot of my projects so far have been in sort of this medtech space, because that fits in well with my background, which was sort of in device development. And so as I came in, I started to work a lot with these large medical technology firms, all of them sort of top of their area um, in terms of market standing. But there's also a good amount of sort of crossover. So I know that in a future project, I'll probably be involved a lot with the pharmaceutical side, because as you know, that medtech and pharma sort of go hand um, in marketing a lot of products nowadays. And so far in my experience, I've also had the opportunity to work with some legacy Guidehouse people as well. So as I mentioned, Guidehouse is more of the public sector organization, but with the Guidehouse, I've worked so far with some military procurement experts that know a lot about procuring for the Defense Department. I've worked with some people in legacy Guidehouse digital team that look at more like sort of software-based consulting for what used to be public sector companies, but now it's getting more and more entangled, which is great. And it sort of offers opportunities for people like me in life sciences to also explore areas in the public sector and see if I like fit in that area a little better. Great. So within life sciences, just a quick summary of the types of projects we do, and we covered this a little bit before, but they fit into sort of these broad buckets: strategy, operations, portfolio strategy, go-to-market strategy, things like that, portfolio management, and then a lot of our projects are especially on the pharmaceutical side, are related to launch and launch planning and market access and things like that. Okay, so how do you apply to Guidehouse? How do you get into Guidehouse? So this, and I think this was, so I don't think you guys have, the career fair has probably already happened. So now it's more about where you got to think about like where you fit into this sort of timeline. But I'm not sure if Handshake still has the jobs posted for Guidehouse, but I do know that we are currently considering intern and senior consultant positions. And for the senior consultant, that's specifically PhDs and MBAs. So if you are interested, I would say the best thing to do is to email me, and I can put you in touch with our recruitment team, and they'll kind of guide you into like where exactly in this timeline do you have to like submit an application and so on. But as I said, as it was with when I got into the company, there's an application, there's a first round interview, a second round interview, and typically a job offer after that. And that process is pretty condensed. Once you get that first interview, within like 2 or 3 weeks, you should know if you have an offer or not, which is great. Kind of helps you plan your future really well. Okay, so once again, you guys can get this email address from the slide, or just get it. Iqbal might send it out later on, and feel free to reach out to me, and I can help you put you in touch with the right people. And if you have more questions specific for healthcare consulting, just let me know, and I can put you in touch with people I know in the healthcare consulting wing as well. Okay. So back to the interviews. So this is coming back to the non-Guidehouse slides, and this is just in general for all consulting.
So I have a question. In your previous slides, you talked about strategy and operations. Those are the areas you are mostly interested in and you are involved. So, I mean, for a non-MBA people like me, I mean, I want to know, can you say something about a specific question in the field of strategy or operation? Like, what do you mean by that? Because we mostly spend a lot of time on the bench and we don't know what what do we mean by strategy, right?
Right. Yeah. No, that's a great question. So, I'll share my experience here. And I had the same sort of fear kind of getting in. Like I don't really know what any of these mean. Um, how can I kind of contribute to these projects based on my experience? And so, on a strategy side, you can think about it in one essence as like what sort of products or what sort of yeah, basically think about it from a marketing sense. So like I have a bunch of products as a company. How should I market these products so that I can get the maximum impact of the product into the market and show differentiation over competitors? And so what that would involve then in a lot of cases is understanding what the product is from a technical side, which we as PhDs should be able to do that. And then another part of it is just speaking to people that use these products and are involved in sort of the marketing and selling of these products, and get their perspectives as well on what they think the strengths of these products might be. And so a lot of it is sort of gathering data through conversations, gathering data to calls with the client, calls with other key stakeholders. These key stakeholders might be physicians in big hospitals. They could be sort of primary care physicians. Kind of get a sense of how all of these stakeholders view maybe a certain product or a certain product profile or the marketing of a certain product, and then sort of put all these learnings together and basically suggest to a client that we think based on everything we have heard, that these are the sort of the key areas that you should focus on, whether it's in selling this product or whether it's in further developing this product. And maybe these are some areas that you might not have looked into earlier that maybe other projects sort of fit in. So, and you probably have the capability to add that extra add-on into your product to sort of meet that capability and be better than your competitors. So I think at a high level, it's very hard to kind of, and for every different product, every different company, this will definitely differ. So it's basically going through a very sort of clear, delineated process, talking to the right people, getting an understanding of what they're trying to accomplish, what the company's trying to accomplish, get perspectives from a lot of different people, tie those perspectives in as sort of data points, and then come up with like a holistic pros, cons, unmet needs, gaps.
So as an entry-level consultant, you could be involved in both data collection and also data analysis, right, to devise a strategy.
Yeah, so coming in as a PhD, you are basically, you can be in all of those. And what I've noticed is you're also on the client-facing side as well. So part of your job will also be to be able to package all of that materials and be able to present it to clients. And so there's amount of learning that happens. There are some workshops, and I think every company, Guidehouse also has sort of workshops to get people up to speed with how to present things effectively. And so, yeah, you'll be doing data collection, you'll be doing the data analysis, you'll be doing the data presentation, and you can also be like a touch point with the client to sort of facilitate the next steps as well. And that's really project dependent, that's really partner dependent, but depending on which partner you're working with in the firm. But I think that your experiences so far as a PhD make you well suited to attack all of those, because presumably during a PhD, you've had enough opportunity to present your data. Think about how well to present your data. What are things that you should put in? What are things that will just ask people will ask questions about that you maybe not be able to answer? So maybe kind of take those materials out. So it's a lot of all of that kind of goes into the types of roles that you'll then be focused on later on.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah,
thanks.
Good question. Yeah. Okay, so with interviews, there's typically two parts, and these apply to both the first round as well as the second round interviews. The first part is a fit. So this is basically behavioral type questions where the company, the interviewer, is basically trying to get an understanding of your background, trying to get an understanding of how well you communicate, your experiences, how well you've demonstrated teamwork, or how well you've demonstrated leaderships, how well you solve problems. And so a lot of this is basically coming up with good elevator pitches on yourself, trying to think of good examples of where you've been able to sort of fix different problems in different ways, and sort of answer behavioral questions. And that typically is the beginning part of the interview. The second part of the interview and the bulk of it tends to be the case interview part. And I think this is the part that is perhaps the most tricky for people jumping in from academia to consulting, because we have like absolute no experience with business cases and how to solve them. The whole case part is basically, it can be interviewer-led or interviewee-led. So with the interviewer-led, you're given, during the interview, you're given the verbal question and you have to kind of show your thought processes in answering that verbal question. The interviewee-led part is you're given the initial prompt and you're basically running, you're basically showing your entire thought process from the beginning to solving whatever that prompt stated as the objective. And you kind of get feedback from the interviewer as you go on, and you can collect more data from the interviewer as you sort of go through the process of solving that prompt. So a lot of this is just basically how well you organize a problem and how well you split the problem into bite-sized questions. And common types of cases that are used in interviews are sort of revenue growth, profitability. Profitability is probably like the thing that people sort of jump into when they learn cases and kind of understand frameworks on how to solve profitability cases. But it could also be business situations and M&A. And later in this presentation, we'll talk a little bit about a growth-specific case and kind of talk about some strategies that might be there to solve a sort of revenue growth-specific case. So I think because because such a small amount of PhDs or advanced degree candidates go into consulting, I think there should be more knowledge out there on how much one should practice for these cases, because not everybody is going to come in with basically a full understanding of what the question that's being asked entails and be able to kind of just rattle off and solve a case. It takes a lot of practice. I would say that 90% of people that are going from PhD into consulting need like at least 50 cases practiced before they actually enter the first interview. And towards this end, there's a lot of resources. I know JHGCC offers a lot of resources. There are some books out there. And these are some of the books that I have found useful or people told me have been useful. A lot of people have case books out there that have a list of cases. And if you ask around your peers, I'm sure they'll be able to help you in identifying some of those case books. But I cannot understate how important practice is. So find partners or find one partner or multiple partners that you can just go back to, schedule Zoom meetings with for an hour or two and just go back and forth with the case. And I think a lot of the confidence that comes later on in solving cases is developed during these practices. Okay. So how do you kind of go about it, and how is the case typically structured? So typically, and this applies to interviewee-led or interviewer-led, and I'm kind of generalizing for both over here. In the beginning part of the case, you're establishing the background. So the interviewer will introduce the case, kind of give you the prompt, and it's your job to kind of understand the underlying objectives behind the prompt and kind of ask clarifying questions to get a full understanding of what you're going to be doing for the next 30-odd minutes. The next part, and I think this is a very important part, is structuring your approach. So typically you will you'll get the prompt, you clarify what the prompt is, and then you spend some time, you ask for some time basically to structure your approach, and then you spend 3 to 4 minutes, sometimes even 5 minutes if you need, to kind of come up with buckets. And we have this concept of MISI, which is mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. What that basically means is you want to structure your approach in buckets, 2 or 3 or 4 buckets, where each bucket is solving a part of the prompt that the other buckets don't solve. And some of the examples later on will show, kind of make that a little clearer. So you want to have mutually exclusive and then collectively exhaustive buckets that can kind of go together in breaking down the prompt and coming up with a clear solution or recommendation based on the prompt. The next part is once you have developed your approach, you present your approach to the interviewer, and if they're okay with it, they might pressure test portions of that approach, and they'll move on to kind of give you some data. And so these data can be presented in graphs, it can be presented verbally, and it's your job to then kind of figure out how to analyze the data. Is it, should we come up with a quantitative way to analyze the data? Should we come up with sort of a qualitative way to assess the data? Once you have done all of that quantitative and qualitative part, you put it all together, and then you develop a recommendation for your interviewer, and then you present it as you would present to like a CEO or some high-level executive at a firm. And typically you'll take some time to kind of write down the key points that you want to put in your recommendation, and then once you're ready, you present it in the most concise manner and clear manner as possible. Okay. So let's jump into a case. And I think the best way to do this will be that for some of the questions, I might ask you to send some of your thoughts via chat. And then for some other ones, it would be great if you guys can just unmute and jump in and offer your thoughts on how you would respond to those questions. Okay. All right. And so general tips as we get into this, you want to be as relaxed as possible. Listen to the question as carefully as possible. In this particular case, you'll have the actual words written out, so you'll be able to see what the question is. So that's good. But know that in actual case, this question is being dictated to you. You're not actually looking at it. So you have to just basically pick up as much of key information as possible, make notes of it, write it down so that you can sort of synthesize that and kind of re-deliver it in a concise manner. Yeah, so be concise, state your assumptions, and we'll give some examples on how to state your assumptions a little later. Make sure that if you're gonna make a conclusion, try to make it based on data. So don't just have a random guess. Data-driven guess is much better. And whenever you can, try to be quantitative. If you're comparing two numbers, try to put in some quantitative comparisons, like this number is this percent bigger than that other number, or this percent is this other one number is 3 times bigger than some other number. Okay, so here's our prompt. So I'll read it to you guys, and then we'll move on to the next step. So our client is a small drug manufacturer called DevCo, and it's based in the United States. And DevCo currently has one drug on the market, sold mainly in the US, but is also sold to a lesser degree in UK and Germany. DevCo is looking to increase its presence in Europe and is considering expanding into Poland, Spain, and France specifically. DevCo is interested in knowing which country it should expand into and what criteria should be used for choosing a country. Okay, so that's your question. The first thing I think we should do is try to see if you understand what the question is asking. And if you don't, try to ask some clarifying questions. So if you guys can, in the chat, feel free to throw in some questions you would want to ask for clarification around this question.
I strongly suggest you unmute yourself and you can ask a question directly. I mean, that will save us some time of typing, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and
Hi, Anu. First of all, thank you for being here. I think one of the things that I was thinking was competition for the drug, what other products exist in those other spaces that they're interested in expanding to.
Absolutely. I think that's a good question to ask. I think another strategy for clarifying questions is to get a good understanding of what exactly they're trying to accomplish. So kind of get a quantitative understanding, if you can, of what the objective of this prompt is. So are they saying that they want to increase something by a certain number by a certain time? If you can kind of coax them into giving you any kind of quantitative insight, that I want to increase the sales of this particular product by this particular percent by this particular time, then I think that would be interesting. But when you phrase your question, you obviously don't want to say what percent do you want to increase your sales. You want to kind of phrase it in a more general term of what is the client's end objective, and by when do you want to meet that objective, something like that.
Thank you.
Are there any? Yeah.
Yeah, just a quick question about this. A couple of questions. So the small drug manufacturer, by that we mean the manufacturer is a small company, not a small molecule drug manufacturer, just to be just confirming on that.
Yes.
And secondly, when we are looking at expanding into a country, we are just looking into sales, not opening a okay, great, thanks.
Yeah, so those are two very good clarifying questions. The first one is that it is a small drug manufacturer, so it's not small molecule. The second one I think is a very important one, which is what it's getting to, like what is sort of the thing that the company is looking to achieve, and by expansion, they want to sell more drugs, and so therefore they want to increase their sales. And so I think getting that information early on, and then the interviewer can tell you something like, oh yeah, we want to increase our sales and get the maximum increase by a certain time frame. That can kind of spawn that kind of answer from the interviewer. So yeah, that's a good question to ask. Anything else?
Are we also assuming that the drug already has regulatory approval in those 3 countries?
Yeah,
and it's not being sold off-label in UK and Germany?
That's a good question, and I think that also can have an effect later on the market share, for example, that the drug will be able to capture. So, and whether a particular timeline can be met. So I think that's another good question to ask.
Oh, I would like to also ask about the exact drug, what disease does it treat, and the prevalence of that condition in these different countries.
Yep, and I think that is one of the most important questions there. And if you want to sell this drug in another country, there has to be a market to sell this drug. And if people don't have that particular disease, if the incidence is low, if there's like if the growth rate is low, then why go into that country and sell that drug? So absolutely, market, very important.
It sounds to me like they are trying to quantitatively approach basically like some type of like regression analysis or something, where you can identify which variable, how it affects the dependent variable. And I'm just curious what those variables might be, those independent variables that we might be factoring in quantitatively once we have data to look at that.
Yeah, and I think that's a bit open-ended, so it might be better to kind of give some examples of the types of variables you would want to look for. So whether that's growth rate or uptake, or I guess treatment rate or something like that, I think that would be better for the interviewer to get an understanding of what is the type of information that you're kind of asking or looking for. So okay. Yeah, I think that question, it has good intentions, but I think was a little more open-ended than what we would like.
Got it.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and jump to sort of 3 clarifying questions that I think stand out and can give the most important pieces of information. And one is, what is the drug, as in what does it treat? Why those 3 countries in Europe? And is there a particular timeline? And these informations can kind of go into better understanding what the major objective is in this particular prompt. And the answers
just a quick question. I'm sorry. I'm wondering would it be beneficial if we ask what caused these drugs to be sold to a lesser degree in UK and Germany, and kind of analyze these factors?
I think that's a good, because that was mentioned in the prompt. So it is something worth asking, because it might be a hint towards that sales might be low in Germany and UK for some reason. And that's why, but I think at the end of the day, they want to, the question is going towards which country should I pick from these 3 countries, right? So if you kind of bog down the analysis towards these other countries that might have slow sales, then you might not, it might basically elongate the timeline to get to the answer of which one of those 3 countries you should choose. So you want to be strategic, and you can ask that questions, you might get an answer, but maybe it's not worth dwelling too much time on that answer, because then it'll kind of take too long to come to a final answer.
I have another question about that, in that these questions here are really broad, and I think a lot of the questions that we asked were encompassed in these.
Mhm.
Are they looking for you when they set up the case? Are they looking for you to ask broad questions that encompass a lot of different topics? So it takes up less time to ask those few questions than it would for us to ask numerous questions that get at these three major categories?
Yeah, I think so. If I give you the answers, I think it'll be probably more clear. So the questions are phrased pretty broadly, and I think it really depends on the interviewer if they want to just probe you more on like what exactly are you asking, or if they'll just straight up give you the answer that you should be looking for, basically. So I think that you have to have an understanding of your interviewer, and I think that first 15 minutes is important into understanding if this is this somebody that is going to kind of keep pushing me towards a very particular answer, or asking my questions in a very particular way, or is this someone that I can ask a question relatively broadly and that can kind of give me more info. So I think what helps in that regard is starting your question broad and then kind of just offering some examples of so like what is the drug our client manufactures, for example, like what indication does it treat, are there multiple indications, and so on. And so that way you covered some example details of the types of answers that they might give, and that also tells them that you're thinking about it in a broad umbrella as well.
I know another quick question.
Mhm.
This is kind of a broader question in general in cases like these. Is it important here to bring in? Is it important to have an understanding of how EU, say, approval process works? So, for example, in EU, should we treat it the question at the face value of it, or should you bring your own domain-specific knowledge into it? Like, for example, approval might not be a question here because if Germany has approved it, that means the entire EU has kind of approved it in terms of regulatory process. Is this information valuable, or should I just treat it at the face value?
I would not bring that up in the clarifying questions part. I would bring that up later in the analysis part. So oftentimes you can mention something like risks of pursuing this route, and then that's where you can mention something like if you do have any idea of like the regulatory process in Germany is like longer than the regulatory process in some other country, then that's something you can bring up as like a potential risk in going into that particular place. I think those area specific insights are useful in showing that you're kind of leveraging your existing understanding as well as your new understanding and kind of putting it all together and synthesizing the information. You want to kind of show that off somewhere, but I don't think the clarifying question is the best place to show that off. It's too early in the case to kind of show that. Here you just want to figure out what are they asking and what type of information should I be looking for in coming up with an answer. And yeah, and I think there was like an example in one of my interviews. I remember it was a case about it was a government that had basically asked the consulting firm to see how they can implement a Wi-Fi hotspots, more Wi-Fi hotspots, and how will that help them in kind of bettering some of the things that some of the infrastructure that are in the country. And so I think one of the things in the country, I think was like some Southeast, it was like Thailand or something. And one of my answers, I think, had to do with like optimizing transportation routes. So if you know where Wi-Fi, through the Wi-Fi hotspots, if you know the location of the people kind of going around the country, then you can optimize transportation. And then something that I just threw in there that I don't even know if this is legitimate or not, but I know that they have like the tuk-tuks, the little like 3-wheelers in Thailand. And I was like, yeah, like those are run by the government, and this can offer sort of better routes or sort of better placements of these around the country. So you're catering to your population a little better. But yeah, adding those like kind of random pieces of knowledge you have shows your breadth of expertise. But I think saving it later on in your conclusions or risks will be a little better. Okay, that's the random tangent. Let's come back to this. So, okay, so I think important pieces of information here is we know that our drug is an anti-clotting drug used during angioplasties, which is type of heart surgery. We're considering those 3 countries because they have the 3 largest populations, essentially, behind UK and Germany. And so that's an important piece of information because that kind of goes towards one of the questions, which was, should we be considering the market in finding the right country? And so this basically says that we're going after the largest population, and hence we're probably going after where the largest market exists. And then the timeline is important as well, and they want to, they're looking at a 5-year time frame. Basically.
I didn't have practice the purpose of been eating these cookies, and it's not good for the stomach. It's just with that much sugar.
Oh.
So you're gonna eat.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
Oh, no problem.
Someone forgot to unmute.
Cookie sounds good to me too.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're looking at a 5-year window. So whatever quantitative analysis that we end up doing, we'll have to project it to a 5-year window. And so let's move on. And I think I am running low on time now, so we'll try to move a little quickly. But important parts here, you want to synthesize the key points. You want to clarify unfamiliar terminology, clarify objective, clarify scope. And then you go into structuring your analysis. So let's see what. Yeah, so as you structure, so what you then want to do is once you get this clarifying information, you basically understood your question. Then you say, look, can you give me like a couple of minutes? I just want to focus on this and come up with those 3 mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive buckets. Doesn't have to be 3, could be between 2 to 4. If you can make more, great. And this is where you can really show your creativity and your problem solving ability and your kind of logical reasoning ability. As you make these buckets, you want to think about how you want to prioritize the buckets. So for example, here, one thing we definitely want to look for is the market. And so I think if you have like market as your first bucket, maybe something else as your second bucket, and then another thing as your third bucket, I think that would be helpful. And I'll let you guys give some ideas of yours for like what those, what 3 or 2 or 3 buckets should be. But before we get to that, another thing that I want to stress is it's good to be creative here. So as you practice cases, and a lot of case books have these stock generic buckets for different types of cases. So for profitability, they'll say, look at like a revenue price and some other one, and cost. And there's like different stock buckets that people have made. It's great to know them. It's great to have them in the back of your mind as you start your practice. But I think as you get more and more involved in your practice, it's good to kind of tinker them as needed for each particular case. So rather than just saying revenue bucket, you want to say something like more specific to your sales of this particular product in this particular market is something I want to look at, or something like that. Or you can be more creative and kind of spin it in a different way. It doesn't have to be just revenue. But creativity always helps in setting up these buckets. Okay, so when you make your bucket, the question you want to answer is what key areas would you want to explore in order to understand which country DevCo should enter. So you guys can unmute yourself and just kind of shout out, just even if it's just 1 area or 2 areas or anything that comes to mind. What are sort of the key areas you'd want to look at in structuring these buckets?
Sales forecast.
Okay, great. Anything else?
Population with heart. I mean, I'm assuming it's because for angioclotting. So I'm assuming population who suffers from heart diseases or is at risk. Or what's the percentage of population that will determine the market?
Okay, and so let's take these 2 examples that we were given, sales forecast and population that has angioplasties. If you were to prioritize these 2, which one would you prioritize and why?
Sales forecast, because it includes the demand.
Okay, but I'm in terms of priority, in terms of what you want to talk to or what kind of data you want to get first. Which data would you think you would be given first?
I think market population is easier to estimate than a sales forecast, because sales forecast can be found out from the market population if we assume a certain percentage of people who will take our drug and who will move into our ecosystem in general. So I think that one, but open to more ideas to see how it goes.
Yeah, I think that's a fair answer, because as you sort of start to come up, or as you start to request data for kind of solving this case, before you can get anything in terms of sales forecast, you'll get you want to get an idea of what sort of market will you reach. And only then can you account for sort of price and then understand how sales will be. So kind of thinking about like when you structure these buckets, what you want to talk about first, what you want to talk about second, what you want to talk about third is important. And seeing like which one will help you figure out the other one is important as well. Okay. So this is just an example. Your buckets don't actually have to be exactly these, but we would want to look for angioplasty market in 3 countries, look at size, growth rate, recent trends. Then to understand market share, we'd want to look at competition. So we obviously will not take over the entire market in these 3 countries. We'll only take a percentage of that market. So who are the other competitors, and how well are they already placed in those countries? How well are they penetrated into the market, and how well can we penetrate into the market? And so part of that is understanding how does our product differ. And then the final one bucket is this sort of tertiary implementation risks. So yeah, great, we can get into this market, but as someone had mentioned earlier, there's regulatory structures and building relationships and all these that can carry some inherent risks. And it's important to kind of delineate some of these risks, because you're saying that you don't have like a single answer for your question because there are a lot of headwinds. So you have some tailwinds, but then you also have some headwinds that can kind of slow your approach or be important barriers to your approach.
So just a quick question. Logistics and manufacturing comes under distribution issues, right?
Sure, yeah. So I think here it could be, yeah. So when you say distribution issues, you say, for example, logistics and manufacturing. But that's not something that's typically asked in particular for this case. So that's something that could be another thing where you say that I understand distribution a little better, and I can say that these are 2 components that go into distribution, and these could be a risk. Yep.
Okay.
And that's something that's very relevant now with the COVID vaccine. So I think that's worth bringing up. Yep. Okay. Data. So we'll look through this real fast. As you're presented data, it's important to come up with sort of a takeaway for each graph that's presented. And it's good to kind of have some quantitative insights into that takeaway. So can someone just give like a quick summary, like a 10-second summary of what they take away from this particular graph? Or it doesn't have to be 10 seconds. Just say like, what is this graph showing you? What does the graph tell you at all?
There's more than a 2.5 times cumulative incidence of angioplasty in France as compared to Poland, and almost double the number in Spain.
Absolutely, yeah. So having those relative comparisons is very important. So yeah, 2.5 times, very good use of the comparisons. And you're basically saying that France has the biggest potential market, most angioplasties, and it's like 2.5 times bigger than one of the other countries we're considering, and bigger than Spain as well. Okay, so that's the first piece of information. And another thing you want to do is just kind of jot down the important details here. So here we have, and we won't go into the quantitative analysis, but here we have just we'd write down that 20,000 angioplasties happen in Poland, 45,000 or so happen in Spain, and then like 75,000 or so happen in France. Next piece of information we get is growth rate. So we know that the rate of angioplasties per year is growing by 10% in Poland. It's relatively flat in Spain. It's actually falling by 5% in France. And we can then take all that information together and kind of get an initial understanding of the market. And they asked us for a 5-year projection. So they can ask us a question of, based on the data, and without going into sales forecast, without going into the other buckets we talked about, just based on the data you have, what are your current thoughts about which market they should enter? And so we can just take these quantitative insights that we've been given via the graph, and come up with some sort of market forecast here. So over 5 years, we know in these different countries, based on a particular growth rate, we'll have a certain amount of people that would be in our total market, not considering how much % of the market we can capture. And I think it's also important when you do these quantitative analysis is to list your assumptions. And so before you actually do that, those calculations, you would say that my assumption is things like the price will be the same. We will acquire 100% of the market, and then I would not assume compounding growth. It would just be the same amount of growth taken from the first year applied to every other year subsequent. So once you set that up and you tell your interviewer, like, this is the analysis I want to do, these are the calculations I want to do, and I will set it up in this sort of table. And if they don't like it, if they think you're missed out something, they'll be like, oh, what about this other part? If they like it, they'll let you do it, and then you can kind of go ahead and finish out your calculations.
Sorry, can you explain why you wouldn't include compounding growth?
You can, but if you make the assumptions that you don't do it and you ask, kind of get permission from your interviewer that you don't need to do it, then it saves you a lot of time.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so basically you want to get the top line insight without spending like hours, or I guess many minutes getting the percentage of like 59.5 or whatever. So if they let you do it, you do it. If they say no, you can't make that assumption, then you compound. Okay. And then once you come up with the answer, it's important to kind of give what the insight is that these numbers provide. So something would be an insight example would be is that based on the data and the assumptions, I would recommend that the client enter the French market, because although the French market is shrinking, it'll still represent the largest market for a client's drug for the next 5 years. So this is a very condensed sort of case. Realistically, something like this would go on to the next step and say, maybe you'll tie it to a price, maybe you'll tie it to there's so much competition and only so much % of the market can be captured. So then you'll have to kind of break those numbers down even further. But this kind of gives you an idea of what the flow of the case could be. Are there any questions here? I think over time, so I just want to go to the final slide if there's no questions.
Please go ahead. I think we can have questions at the end.
Okay, great. Okay, so just final thoughts, things that I think I've kind of learned in my 4 months and hopefully will solidify as I work more, is a lot of consulting is, they say, having strong opinions loosely held. So we come from an environment where, at least for PhDs, we're sort of the subject matter experts. We know what we have based on our data and no one else has that data. So we're pretty sure about our conclusions. And people that challenge us typically have not done the same experiment, so they don't know what they're talking about. In this particular case, you're going up against people and clients that have had way more experience than you in gaining insights. And so having strong opinions, data, verified opinions is very important, and being able to convey that with confidence is very important. But you also have to assess what kind of pushback you get on those, and have the ability to kind of be agile and sort of structure your opinions based on input that you get from your clients as well, and not be like too hell-bent on just one way and one approach. Opportunities to learn continuously. So I have been exposed to very many therapeutic areas, orthopedic, cardiovascular, trauma, and just the list goes on. And I think I've learned a lot than I ever did in my PhD in terms of these different new therapeutic areas. My PhD was very deeply focused into like one type of diagnostics for one type of infectious disease. And now I'm kind of getting a way, way broader set of learning. And I think that helps. I think that kind of was what I was looking for in a consulting career, is to get an understanding, a broader understanding, and be able to apply some of my learnings from PhD into like these new areas. And I think I'm getting an opportunity to do that. You get to interface with executives, be exposed to decision-making up close. That's like almost true for most management consulting jobs. Career flexibility we talked about before. There's some cool blogs and other resources online if you want to look at how people are discussing different consulting projects. But I think the most important of these resources will be your peers, at least if you are looking to start preparing for interviews. Leverage your peers, leverage JHGCC, start practicing like right away and a lot. So practice, practice, practice. I think that should be like the key takeaway here is practice cases. Great. Yeah, otherwise, thanks for your guys' time. I'm happy to take any questions for like a couple of minutes, but I do have to kind of bounce in a little bit.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Anu. That was really helpful, and I think so far one of the best sessions that I've hosted. You guys can ask your questions in the chat box, or I'll conclude with some announcements. No questions? Okay. A lot of appreciation for you, Anu. Thank you. You can
Thank
see
you,
it in the
guys.
chat box. Well, yeah, so I mean, this is going to be the last one for this year, and I hope, I wish you all a very happy holidays. And the next time we will meet will be on January 29th. And we have another fantastic lineup of speakers from both industry and academia, people from BCG, LEK, Life Sciences, Consulting, Bain, Simon Kucher, and some of the speakers will also bring in recruiters from their company. So it would be a good idea to network with them and also learn about different. So every time we have someone from a new company, we will have a different topic like strategy and career pivots and all these things. The next one will be on January 29th, where we'll have, I'll send out the links, but just to give you a heads up, it's going to be Manu Lakshmanan. He's a former McKinsey consultant, and he has written a book on case interviews. So that, I guess, will be helpful. And as Anu has suggested, practice, practice, practice. So with that, I'd like to close this session, and thanks a lot for your time. Thanks, Anu.
All right, thanks, guys.
Thank you.